When my husband told me his wish, I thought he was joking. We were sitting at the dinner table, the sound of the clock filling the quiet between us. He spoke with the same calmness he used when asking for salt. "I think people should be more honest about attraction," he said, cutting into his food like it was a harmless comment. I remember smiling, unsure how to respond. But the tone in his voice wasn't playful. It was thoughtful. Serious. That was the night everything in my marriage quietly began to shift. Imran wasn't a bad husband. He was predictable, composed, careful with his words. We had been married for 5 years, and by all accounts, our life looked perfect from the outside. A nice apartment, steady routines, polite conversations, a shared sense of order. But what we didn't share anymore was warmth. There was a distance that crept in silently, the kind that doesn't come with arguments or slammed doors. It just grows with every untouched moment, every smile that never reaches the eyes. Our mornings had become mechanical. He'd read the news on his phone while I made coffee. We'd say things like, "Don't forget your files," or "The laundry's in the machine," but there was no laughter, no spark. Some days I'd watch him leave and realize I hadn't touched him in a week. Some nights I'd lie next to him and feel like I was lying beside a polite stranger. I used to think marriage died with anger. But ours was dying in silence. So when Imran said those words about honesty and attraction, something in me froze. I tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh. "Are you saying you're attracted to someone?" I asked lightly. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me and said, "I think attraction isn't something you can control. But hiding it makes it worse." His tone was almost philosophical, like he was explaining a theory, not confessing something that might break us. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind searched for a response, something logical, something that wouldn't sound desperate. I ended up saying, "You're overthinking," but deep down, I knew he wasn't. He had already thought about it too much. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. His words kept looping in my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. Honesty. Freedom. Curiosity. The words sounded harmless until you placed them inside a marriage. The next morning, I acted normal. I made breakfast, packed his lunch, watched him leave. But as soon as the door closed, I felt something new sitting in my chest, a strange mix of fear and awareness. For the first time, I began to wonder about my own heart. About what I'd been missing. And the following days, I caught myself observing him differently. The way he smiled when his phone buzzed, the way he avoided long conversations with me. I didn't think he was unfaithful, not yet, but I sensed his mind was elsewhere, exploring a version of life where I didn't exist. I started going for walks in the evening, something I hadn't done in months. I told myself it was for air, for clarity, but it was mostly to escape the silence of the house. One evening, while returning home, I saw Adil, Imran's friend and business partner, stepping out of his car. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that notices. We exchanged a few polite words, nothing unusual, but when he said, "You look tired, everything okay?" his tone was sincere, not casual. It startled me how easily I wanted to answer truthfully. Adil was different from Imran. Where Imran was quiet and composed, Adil had a kind of warmth that filled the space around him. I'd met him many times before at dinners, office gatherings, family functions. He was always respectful, always gentle with his words. But that day, for the first time, I noticed something else, a softness in his eyes, a kind of unspoken familiarity. When I went home that night, I kept replaying that short exchange. The way he looked at me, the ease in his voice, the absence of judgment. It felt wrong to think about it, but I couldn't help it. For years, I had been starving for attention and didn't even realize it. One genuine moment of concern felt like a feast. That's when Imran's wish began to twist in my mind. What did he really mean when he said people should be honest about attraction? Was he asking for permission? Or offering it? Days passed. Imran became busier than usual, traveling for work, spending late nights on calls. Our conversations shrank into brief updates, logistics of living, nothing emotional. I wanted to ask him about that dinner night again, but something in me was afraid of the answer. Maybe I already knew. One evening, as I sat alone scrolling through old photos on my phone, I saw a picture of us from our early days. We looked happy, careless, in love. I barely recognized those people. I wondered when exactly the shift had happened, when we had turned into me and him. Maybe love doesn't vanish, it just fades under the weight of unspoken things. Later that night, while folding his clothes, I found one of his old notebooks from college. Inside, on a random page, he had written a quote, "Freedom is not breaking the bond. It's choosing it every day." I stared at it for a long time. It sounded beautiful, but I couldn't tell if he still believed it. When he returned home late, I pretended to be asleep. He leaned over to kiss my forehead, but I didn't move. My heart wanted to respond, but something stronger, maybe pride, maybe confusion, kept me still. I realized then that silence had become our safest language. As I lay there in the dark, his earlier words echoed again. We should be honest about attraction. I thought about Adil, about how easily he had made me feel seen. And for the first time, I understood how dangerous honesty could be when love starts to disappear. Imran started traveling more often after that. His messages became shorter, his calls less frequent. I told myself it was work, that I shouldn't read too much into it, but deep down, I knew distance was no longer physical, it was emotional. He'd gotten used to life without conversation, and I was beginning to accept the quiet as normal. Days would pass without a word that carried meaning. I'd wake up, go about my routine, and feel invisible in my own home. One evening, Adil called to drop off some business papers Imran had forgotten. I almost told him to leave them with the guard, but something in me wanted company, or maybe just a familiar voice. When he arrived, he smiled like he always did, gentle, patient, with eyes that seemed to notice things others missed. We talked for a few minutes, mostly about work, until he asked how I was holding up. I said I was fine, the automatic answer everyone gives. But then he asked again, quietly, "Really?" That single word broke something small inside me. I found myself talking more than I planned, about Imran's absence, the silence at home, the confusion that never left me. He didn't interrupt, just listened, and that was enough to make me feel seen for the first time in months. The next day, I thought about that conversation longer than I should have. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him, and when it wasn't, I felt a strange disappointment. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just friendship, empathy, a passing comfort. But part of me knew what was happening. The heart doesn't always fall loudly, sometimes. It just leans quietly toward the warmth it misses. A few days later, Adil texted, asking if I'd had dinner. It was simple, almost trivial, but my hands shook before replying. That message became the start of something I wasn't ready to name. We began to talk more often, mostly at night. He'd ask how I was, I'd ask about his day, and between those lines, emotions began to form, small, careful, dangerous. I'd catch myself smiling at his messages, feeling guilty for it. But guilt, when fed often enough, starts to lose its taste. Imran returned briefly between trips, and I tried to act normal. But his presence felt foreign now. We sat at the same table but occupied different worlds. When he spoke, my mind drifted elsewhere. The man in front of me felt like a memory, while the man on my phone felt real. I hated that truth, yet I couldn't escape it. One evening, when Imran was away again, Adil stopped by. It wasn't planned. He had come to pick up a document Imran had left behind. I told myself it would be a short visit. But when he stepped in, carrying the faint scent of rain, something in the air changed. We sat down, talked a little, laughed quietly. Then there was a silence, one of those pauses that say more than words ever could. He looked at me, searching my eyes as if asking permission. I didn't move. I should have stood up, should have drawn a line, but instead, I stayed still. That stillness was my answer. After he left, I told myself nothing had happened. But the truth was, something had shifted permanently. A boundary had moved, quietly and invisibly. I began to think about him constantly, his voice, his patience, the way he made space for my words. I'd catch myself comparing him to Imran, not in appearance but in presence. One made me feel absent, the other made me feel alive. Days turned into weeks. Our conversations grew more open, more emotional. I told him things I'd never told anyone, how I felt forgotten, how I missed being looked at with love, how I wasn't sure if I was even lovable anymore. He listened, always without judgment. Sometimes he'd tell me I deserved more, and though I knew it was wrong to hear that from him, I needed to. The night it finally happened, there were no grand declarations or sudden decisions. It was quiet, slow, almost hesitant. We sat close, words stopped making sense, and for the first time in years, I felt wanted. But it wasn't passion that drove it, it was emptiness. The kind that swallows you whole when you've been starved too long. I wish I could say I stopped, but I didn't. I let it happen, convincing myself it was what Imran had asked for: honesty, freedom, curiosity. I told myself this was my version of honesty. Afterward, silence filled the room like smoke. Adil looked at me, uncertain, and said, "You didn't say no." I couldn't look at him. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Guilt has a strange way of numbing you before it breaks you. I just nodded, unable to form words. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away gently. The warmth I'd been craving now burned like shame. When he left, I sat in the dark, my hands trembling. The room smelled of rain and regret. I wanted to erase everything that had just happened, but I couldn't. I thought about Imran, his calm voice, his strange wish, his trust. A part of me hated him for planting the thought of freedom, another part hated myself for using it as an excuse. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing Adil's voice, his words echoing like a confession I couldn't undo. I wondered if Imran had ever felt this kind of guilt, if he had already done what he'd so carefully hinted at. Maybe that was why his conscience seemed so calm. Maybe he had wanted me to do the same so he wouldn't feel alone in betrayal, but there was no freedom in what I felt. Just a heavy silence sitting in my chest. I thought about how easy it had been to cross the line once it blurred, how one small choice could destroy years of certainty. I used to think betrayal began with touch. Now I knew it began with attention, the moment you start waiting for someone else's message more than your husband's. As the night faded, I realized something cruelly honest: Imran's wish had come true. I had given him the kind of honesty he wanted, just not in the way he imagined. And though I couldn't see the future yet, a quiet part of me knew nothing would ever feel right again.
The morning after should have been filled with warmth, with laughter echoing from relatives still lingering in the house, with me holding on to the glow of being newly married. Instead, I carried the heaviness of a secret I had no one to share with. Every glance I gave Ayan felt strained, every smile forced. He moved around effortlessly, greeting family members, playing the role of a husband as though nothing weighed on him. That perfect mask of his both fascinated and terrified me, how easily he could bury truths beneath his charm. That I noticed Saad that morning, standing off to the side, his eyes resting on me with a concern he didn't voice. He was Ayan's cousin, close like a brother, someone who had always been kind without stepping too close. But his silence had a shape to it, the kind of silence that carries knowledge it cannot share. Later, when I found a moment alone, he approached me carefully, like someone debating whether to pull a bandage off a wound. His words came hesitant, but they landed like blows. He told me there were things I didn't know about Aya, things that would hurt, but things I deserved to hear. At first, I wanted to run from the conversation. The last thing I wanted was another fracture in the illusion I was already struggling to hold together. But Saad's tone carried no malice, only a reluctant honesty. He told me that even while Ayan had been preparing to marry me, he hadn't let go of another woman. The relationship hadn't ended when it should have. It bled into our engagement, kept alive in secret meetings, hidden conversations, late-night calls that family never noticed. My chest constricted as the words sank in. Part of me clung to the possibility that Sod was mistaken, but deep inside, I knew he wasn't. His eyes didn't lie, his voice didn't waver. I asked if it was Sarah, my mind desperate to fit the pieces into one betrayal instead of two, but his silence told me otherwise. This wasn't Sarah, it was someone else. A woman I didn't know, someone outside the walls of my world, yet someone who had been close enough to occupy the place I thought was mine alone that I felt the ground slipping beneath me. First Sarah, now this shadowy figure I couldn't even name. The betrayal spread wider, growing roots into places I couldn't reach. I tried to steady my breathing, to keep myself from unraveling in front of Sod, but inside I was collapsing. He didn't say more, only muttered that he had kept quiet to protect the family, to avoid scandal. But watching me now, he could no longer carry it in silence. Then he left me with the weight of his confession, leaving me to drown in questions with no answers. That night, I searched. While Ayan stepped into the shower, I looked through his belongings with trembling hands, not sure if I wanted proof or reassurance. What I found was worse than I expected, another phone, tucked away in the drawer beneath neatly folded clothes. A phone I had never seen before. The messages were there, threads of conversations with a name saved only as an initial. Words of affection, late-night promises, talk of missed moments and secret meetings. Some messages were weeks old, others from just days before the wedding. The kind of intimacy that shouldn't exist outside the vows we were meant to share. My body shook as I put it back exactly as I found it, every nerve in me screaming. The walls around me seemed to close in, the room colder than it had been a moment before. When Ayan emerged, smiling, casual, wrapping his arms around me like nothing had shifted, I almost screamed. How could he look at me with such ease while carrying such deceit? His touch burned with questions I couldn't ask, his smile carved wounds I couldn't reveal. I tried subtle confrontations. I asked about loyalty, about honesty, speaking in hypotheticals, hoping he would flinch, hoping he would break the act. But he didn't. His answers were smooth, measured, almost rehearsed. His denial of any wrongdoing was wrapped in laughter, as though my questions were naive. He kissed my forehead and told me to stop worrying, that love was enough. And yet, the more he spoke, the less I believed. Every moment with him now carried a dual edge. His gestures of affection no longer comforted me, they mocked me. The promises he had made at the altar, so grand and public, now felt hollow. My heart replayed Sod's confession, the secret phone, the messages from a woman I couldn't even picture. What was I to Ayan, a partner, or simply a mask he wore to please his family while his heart wandered elsewhere? I lay awake again that night, my body stiff beside his, unable to surrender to rest. I thought of how marriage was meant to be built on trust, on truth, and how mine was already drowning in lies. The past with Sarah was a wound, but this ongoing deception was a disease spreading into the very core of what we were supposed to be. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the distance between us wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Ayan was hiding behind walls he had built long before me, and I was just beginning to see how high they really were. By the time dawn broke, my mind was filled with a chilling certainty. Love wasn't the foundation of this marriage. Secrets were. And I knew, with a sinking heart, that this was only the beginning of what I was about to uncover. This is section 2, almost equals 770 words. Shall I continue with section 3, 760 words, to complete the story arc with the final shocking secret?
It had been months since I'd last felt anything close to excitement. My days blurred into routines: coffee in the same cup, folded clothes in the same pile, dinner at the same time for a man who barely looked up from his phone. Hassan wasn't cruel or careless, he was just occupied. Everything between us had turned efficient, love reduced to schedules, affection hidden behind reminders and receipts. Sometimes I'd watch him get ready in the morning, adjusting his tie in the mirror, and wonder when we stopped looking at each other with interest instead of obligation. That evening started like any other. I had gone out to pick up groceries, thinking the walk might clear my head. It was the kind of dull winter drizzle that seeps into your bones, turning everything gray and quiet. Hassan had texted that he'd be late again, another office dinner, another apology that didn't sound like one. I waited outside the store, the rain getting heavier, the street emptying out. My phone buzzed, a name I recognized but didn't expect: Saad. My husband's colleague that we'd met only twice before, at a company gathering and once when he dropped off some documents. He was polite, always maintaining the kind of respectful distance that made me comfortable. He asked if I needed a ride. He'd seen me from the parking lot, drenched and waiting. I hesitated. The thought of sitting in a car with him alone felt strange, maybe even wrong. But the rain was relentless, and Hassan's call history told me not to expect a rescue. So, I said yes. The car smelled faintly of cologne and rain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wipers kept rhythm with the silence, slicing through the dark. I focused on the raindrops racing each other down the glass, pretending not to notice his occasional glances. Then, gently, he asked, "Do you still paint?" It took me a second to register. That one question, so simple, yet somehow so personal. I hadn't mentioned painting in months, maybe years. Hassan had once told him, I assumed. I nodded, smiling faintly. Not really. Haven't had time. He laughed softly, not mocking, just knowing. You should. It suits you. Those words shouldn't have meant anything. But they did. They broke through the fog I'd been walking in for so long. Someone remembered something about me that wasn't connected to being a wife or a caretaker. I found myself talking about colors, unfinished canvases, how I'd stopped because everything around me felt gray. He listened. Not the polite kind of listening people do to pass time, but the kind that makes you feel noticed. Halfway home, the rain grew heavier, blurring everything outside. The world felt suspended, as if the car were moving through another dimension where conversation mattered more than the rules waiting beyond the door. He told me about his transfer from another city, about missing his mother's cooking, about how the city felt cold despite its crowds. I laughed more than I had in weeks. When we finally reached my street, I felt an unexpected pang, disappointment that the ride was ending. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly, pretending to check my phone. He turned off the engine but didn't move. For a second, we both sat there, surrounded by the sound of rain hitting metal. His eyes met mine, not with intention, but with something softer, something questioning that I looked away first. "Thank you for the ride," I said, my voice lower than I intended. That he smiled, almost apologetically. "Anytime." That word lingered as I stepped out, pulling my shawl tighter against the cold. I walked toward the house, the glow from the porch light spilling onto the wet pavement. I didn't turn back, but I felt his gaze following me, respectful yet heavy inside. The house smelled of leftover food and quiet. I dropped the grocery bags on the counter and stared at the clock. Hassan wouldn't be home for hours. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. There was color in my cheeks, a faint brightness in my eyes that had nothing to do with happiness, but with awakening that I told myself it was harmless. Just a ride. Just a conversation. Nothing more. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence began to stretch. Every small detail of that drive replayed in my mind: the sound of his voice, the way he said my name, the flicker of his smile when I spoke. It was ridiculous, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That I wondered why something so simple had shaken me. Maybe because it reminded me of a version of myself I'd forgotten. The one who used to feel, to laugh, to be curious. Hassan's absence had left a space inside me, and for the first time, someone had accidentally stepped into it. When Hassan came home later that night, I pretended to sleep. I could hear him change quietly, his familiar scent drifting across the room. He leaned over to kiss my forehead, and I almost turned to face him, but didn't. I wasn't angry, just disconnected. The sound of rain still echoed in my ears, and for reasons I didn't want to name, that short drive had followed me home. That I kept telling myself it was nothing. That's how it always begins, with a harmless favor, a moment of kindness. But sometimes, all it takes for a life to shift is a few unspoken words between two people sitting in the rain.